The year was 1886, and the town of Laramie Fork, Wyoming, was doing its best to celebrate the harvest. Bunting, faded from the high desert sun, drooped between the unpainted false fronts of the general store and the saloon. The wind, however, carried no scent of baking pies or spiced cider. It came down from the mountains already tasting of iron and the season's first sharp frost. It was a cold wind that promised a harder winter than most were prepared for. In the center of this forced cheer, Maybelle Sims stood in the cramped parlor of her family's mortgaged home, suffocating. She was being laced into a wedding dress. It was not a dress of airy white cotton. It was heavy ivory satin, freighted from Cheyenne at great expense. The whalebone corset beneath it was a cage, pinching her ribs until she could only draw shallow, trembling breaths. The dress was a gift from her groom, Hezekiah Burns. Hezekiah Burns was a man who owned things. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. He owned the bank that held the note on her father's failed homestead. And by noon tomorrow, he would own her. Maybelle stared at her reflection in the warped, silver-backed mirror. The girl looking back was 19. Her eyes, usually the color of prairie skies in summer, were flat and cold, like river stones. Hezekiah Burns was nearly 30 years her senior, a widower twice over. The town whispered that his first 2 wives had not died easily. Burns was a powerful man, a ruthless man, and he was the only man who could save her family from ruin. The parlor door creaked open. Her mother, Martha, entered, her hands twisting in her apron. She was a woman worn down to bone and nerve by drought and debt. "They're ringing the church bells," Martha said, her voice thin. "Testing them for tomorrow. It sounds lovely, doesn't it?" Maybelle said nothing. She watched her mother's reflection. "Maybelle, please," Martha whispered, stepping closer. The smell of lye soap and fear clung to her. "You must understand. This is the only way. Your father, he left us with nothing but his pride and a stack of bills high as a man's chest." "He left us the ranch," Maybelle said, her voice hollow. "The bank owns the ranch," her mother corrected, her voice cracking. "Mr. Burns owns the bank. He has been generous. He has offered to forgive the entire debt." She reached out a chapped hand and touched the satin sleeve. "All he asks for in return is you. It is a great honor. Maybelle, he is a wealthy man. You will want for nothing." "I will want for air," Maybelle said, the words barely audible. "I will want for the right to say no." Martha's face hardened. The desperation that had been simmering beneath her skin finally broke through. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I want to see my only daughter shackled to that man? We have no choice. The banknote is due in 2 days. We will be turned out, into the street, into that." She gestured toward the window, at the wind-blown dust and the coming winter. "I will not freeze to death on the prairie. Maybelle, I will not. You are the only thing we have left to sell." The words hit Maybelle with the force of a physical blow. Sell? The truth, stripped bare of all pretense of love or security. She was livestock, a bargaining chip. Her mother saw the shift in her eyes, the flicker of rebellion hardening into something dangerous. "You will do this," Martha commanded, her brief moment of honesty replaced by a grim resolve. "You will walk down that aisle tomorrow, and you will smile. You will smile for Mr. Burns, and you will save this family. You owe us this. Your father's memory demands this sacrifice." Maybelle looked away from the mirror, meeting her mother's frantic gaze. She nodded, a slow, cold movement. "Yes, Mama, I understand. The sacrifice." Her mother sagged with relief, mistaking obedience for defeat. Good girl. Now, let us finish the fitting. The seamstress must be paid." Martha left the room to fetch the woman. Maybelle stood motionless, listening to the chime of the church bells. They were not lovely. They were a toll. 1, 2, 3, counting down the hours left of her life. Her gaze drifted from the mirror to the small mantelpiece. Beside her father's tarnished militia medal lay his old skinning knife. It was not large, but the blade was sharp, worn thin from years of use. While her mother's footsteps faded down the hall, Maybelle moved, her fingers, numb and stiff, closed around the wooden handle. The leather sheath was stiff. She worked the knife free. It was cold against her palm. She looked down at the layers of satin and lace. With steady hands, she lifted the heavy skirt and found the deep, hidden pocket the seamstress had sewn into the bustle for a handkerchief. The knife slid inside, its weight a dense, secret comfort against her thigh. She did not know if the blade was for Hezekiah Burns or for herself. She only knew she would not be taken alive. Her eyes were ice as the church bells rang again. Night fell like a hammer blow. The house was quiet, suffocating in the expectation of the morning. Maybelle lay fully clothed on her cot. The wedding dress hung like a headless ghost in the corner. She had not been allowed to wear her own clothes. She was to be kept pristine. They had locked her door. It was a flimsy lock. Her father had taught her how to pick it with a hairpin when she was 10, a game from his rowdier days. It took her less than a minute. She moved through the dark house like a shadow. She took no food, no money. She had nothing, and she would take nothing. In the lean-to kitchen, she pulled on her worn riding boots and her father's old wool coat. It smelled of tobacco and horse, a scent that made her throat tighten. The stable was behind the house. Her mare, a pale buckskin named Dust, nickered softly as she approached. "Shh, girl," Maybelle whispered, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She saddled the horse with frantic, practiced hands. She led Dust out onto the street, her hooves muffled by the thick dust that had turned to mud in the shadows. The town was dark. The saloon had emptied early. Even the revelers were saving themselves for the wedding feast tomorrow. The feast that would be paid for with her body. She mounted and did not look back. She did not ride for the main road. That would be the first place Burns looked. She urged the mare toward the high country, the broken rocky foothills that climbed toward the Laramie Peak. It was a harder path, a dangerous one, but it was the only one she knew. The wind howled, a living thing that tore at her coat and stung her face with particles of sand and ice. An early snow had begun to fall, not the soft blankets of midwinter, but a hard, stinging sleet. She rode for hours, pushing the mare hard, her mind a numb void of terror. She heard them before she saw them. The thud of hoofbeats behind her, moving faster than hers, heavier, 2, maybe 3 riders. She didn't need to see them to know who they were. Burns's men. He must have posted a watch on the house. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her numbness. She kicked Dust into a gallop, veering off the faint game trail and into the treacherous scree. "Go, girl, go!" The men behind her shouted. A gunshot split the night. The bullet whined off a rock far to her left. They were not trying to kill her. They were trying to turn her, to frighten her horse. Dust scrambled up a steep embankment, her iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the flint. The sleet was turning to snow now, thick and wet, clinging to her eyelashes, blinding her. She was riding blind, trusting the horse. The ground dropped away suddenly. It was a dry wash, invisible in the swirling snow. Dust saw it too late. The mare leaped, twisting in midair, but her hind legs slipped on the icy rock. The horse went down, screaming. Maybelle was thrown clear. She landed hard on her shoulder against the frozen bank, a sharp, searing pain shooting from her collarbone down to her wrist. She gasped. The air knocked from her lungs. The horse was struggling, its leg trapped. The men were closer now, crashing through the brush. "This way! I heard the horse!" Maybelle scrambled to her feet, ignoring the fire in her shoulder. She slapped the mare's rump. "Get up! Go!" The horse, frantic, found its footing and lunged up the other side, disappearing into the white curtain of the storm. She was alone, on foot and injured. She ran, She plunged into a stand of thick pine, the low-hanging branches whipping her face. The snow was covering her tracks almost as fast as she made them. The shouts of the men grew fainter, confused by the terrain and the storm. She half ran, half fell for what felt like miles. Her left arm held tight against her ribs. The cold was seeping into her, a deep, deadly chill that made her bones ache. She was slowing. She knew she could not last long out here. Just as despair began to pull her under, she stumbled through a line of broken fencing and fell to her knees. She looked up. Through the driving snow, she saw a shape, a structure. It was low and dark. A barn. It was part of an old, derelict ranch, one she vaguely remembered her father talking about. A place haunted by bad luck, abandoned years ago. She pulled herself up and staggered toward it. The large barn door was missing, leaving a gaping black maw. She slipped inside, out of the wind. The blackness was total. The air was thick with the smell of dust, ancient hay, and animal musk. But it was dry. She leaned against a support beam, gasping, her entire body shaking violently, as much from cold as from fear. "Stay right where you are." The voice came from the darkness in front of her. It was not one of the men from the town. This voice was low, rough, and absolutely calm. A match scraped against wood. A small flame flared, illuminating the face of the man holding it. He lit a lantern, and the golden light pushed the shadows back. He was not what she expected. He was tall, leaner than the broad-shouldered men in town, but built with a wiry strength. He looked to be 30, perhaps older. His face was all harsh angles, his jaw dark with stubble, and his eyes, deep set beneath a low brow, were the color of gunmetal. They assessed her with a cold, unsettling intelligence. He wore stained denim pants and a wool coat that had seen better decades. A pistol rested easily in a holster on his hip. He was, she realized, completely still. He had been here the whole time, watching her. "You're trespassing," he said. His voice was flat. Maybelle tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too hard. She was a ruin. Her hair was matted with snow and pine needles. Her father's coat was torn, and the sleeve over her injured arm was dark, though she couldn't tell if it was mud or blood. I, she stammered. The man's eyes narrowed. He raised the lantern slightly. His gaze moved over her, noting the torn coat, the shaking, the way she cradled her arm. He was a man who lived alone, and he was not accustomed to visitors, especially not terrified women in the middle of a blizzard. "Who's after you?" he asked. Not what happened, but who? "Burns," she choked out. "Hezekiah Burns." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not recognition, perhaps, but understanding. He understood what a man like Burns meant. They were shooting my horse. I fell." She was rambling, the shock setting in. "Please, I'm so cold." The man, Eli, watched her for another long moment. His suspicion was a palpable thing in the air. He saw the tracks she'd left in the snow, the single set of small boots. He saw no one else. She was alone. He looked at the ruined coat, and then, beneath it, he saw the mud-splattered hem of a fine dress. Satin. His eyes lifted back to her face. He saw she was not a thief. She was bait. I won't cause trouble," Maybelle pleaded, desperation making her bold. "I have nothing. They'll kill me if they find me. Or worse. Please, just until the storm passes. One night." Eli lowered the lantern. He stared at the spot where she had fallen, then back at her. He seemed to be weighing the trouble she brought against the certainty of her death if he turned her out. The wind screamed outside, rattling the loose timbers of the barn. He gave a single curt nod. He turned and walked toward a cleaner stall, one that held a bedroll and a saddle. He picked up a heavy, dark wool blanket. It looked coarse and smelled of smoke. He tossed it to her. Maybelle fumbled, catching it with her good hand. "Thank you. God bless." "Don't!" He cut her off. He picked up his lantern. "Stay in the barn. Don't come near the house. Don't light a fire." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the barn, his footsteps silent, disappearing into the swirling snow, heading for a small, dark shape she now recognized as the main ranch house, barely more than a cabin. Maybelle sank onto a pile of old hay, pulling the rough blanket around her shoulders. The relief was so profound it was painful. She was safe, for now. She was shaking too hard to cry. She pulled her knees to her chest, the hidden knife pressing against her thigh, a cold reminder of the choice she had almost made. The first night passed in a fugue of cold and silence. The only sound was the relentless shriek of the wind as it hammered the barn walls, finding every crack in the old wood. Some 50 yards away, in the dark cabin, Eli stood at the window. He did not light his own lamp. He had watched the faint glow of Maybelle's lantern until it went out, plunging the barn back into blackness. He rolled a cigarette, the paper a ghostly white in the gloom. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his hard features. He lit the cigarette and stood there, smoking, his eyes fixed on the barn. He watched the darkness, his mind turning over the cost of the trouble that had just walked out of the storm and into his world. He did not sleep. He just watched and waited for the dawn. Maybelle woke to a cold so deep it felt like it was inside her bones. The pain in her shoulder was a dull, heavy spike, and a sharper, emptier pain gnawed at her stomach. For a confused moment, she thought she was in her bed, that the nightmare of the wedding was over, but the smell of ancient hay and the rough, smoky wool of the blanket against her cheek brought the truth crashing back. She was in a barn. She was a runaway. She was, for the first time in her life, truly and completely alone. The storm had quieted, but the wind still moaned around the corners of the building, a low, mournful sound. Gray light filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating a world of dust motes and frost. She was stiff, her body a collection of aches. The satin dress, hidden beneath her father's coat, was bunched and cold, its fine fabric ruined by mud and snow. Hunger was a physical force. It pushed her to her feet. She had to eat. She looked toward the cabin. It sat 50 yards away, a plume of smoke rising ruler straight from its stone chimney. He was in there. The man, Eli. He had given her a blanket but had offered no food, no warmth, no welcome. He had drawn a line as clear as a fence post. This barn for her, that house for him. But the hunger was stronger than her fear. She slipped out of the barn, her boots making no sound in the fresh snow. The world was white and silent. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. She moved quickly, feeling like a thief, her good hand clutching the heavy wool coat shut. The cabin door was not locked. She paused, her hand on the rough wooden latch. This was his space. To enter it uninvited was a violation, perhaps a dangerous one. She thought of Hezekiah Burns, of his wet mouth and the hard, possessive grip of his hands. Then she thought of the man in the barn, his cold eyes and the gun on his hip. She did not know which was worse, but the hunger decided for her. She eased the door open. The inside was one small room, dark but surprisingly clean. A fire crackled in a cast-iron stove, providing the only real light. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a single chair and a small table against the other. In the far corner, a set of shelves held a few tins, a sack of flour, and a side of bacon. He was not there. The relief was so sudden it made her dizzy. She darted to the shelves. Her eyes fell on a half-eaten loaf of dark bread. Her hands, clumsy with cold, tore a piece from it. She crammed it into her mouth, not even tasting it. It was dry, dense, and the most wonderful thing she had ever eaten. She tore off another piece, then another, swallowing so fast she nearly choked. She was reaching for a third piece when the sound of an axe splitting wood, just outside the single window, stopped. She froze. The silence that followed was absolute. The door opened. Eli stood there, framed against the bright, white snow. He was larger than she remembered, his shoulders filling the doorway. He held the axe in one hand. Snowflakes melted in his dark hair. His eyes went from her face, to her mouth, to the bread she was clutching in her fist. Maybelle's throat closed. She could not speak. She expected him to yell, to hit her, to drag her out by the hair and throw her back into the snow. Burns would have, her mother would have shrieked at the waist. Eli did none of those things. He simply looked at her, his face impassive. The silence stretched, drawn thin and tight. He held her gaze for a full 10 seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped inside, shut the door, and leaned the axe against the wall. He walked past her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his coat, and went to the stove. He picked up a tin coffee pot. "There's coffee," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Maybelle stared at him, the bread still clutched in her hand. He gestured with the pot toward a tin cup on the table. She nodded, unable to form words. He poured a stream of black liquid into the cup. It smelled bitter and strong. He took his own cup from a nail on the wall and poured one for himself. He leaned against the wall near the stove, sipping the coffee, watching her over the rim. "The storm's settling," he said. It was not conversation. It was a statement of fact. "It'll hold for another day, maybe 2. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "For the bread." He gave a short, dismissive shrug. "Food's food." He drank his coffee. "You can't stay in the barn. You'll freeze solid by morning." She looked at him, confused. "Where?" He motioned with his head toward the corner. "There's hay in the loft. It's warmer. But you don't come in here again unless I say—" It was an order, but it was also a reprieve. He was not throwing her out. "I can work," she said, the words tumbling out. I'm not useless. I can cook. I can mend clothes. I can help with your horse. I won't be a burden. I promise." He looked at her, at the ruined satin peeking from beneath the oversized coat, at her soft, unmarked hands. He clearly did not believe her, but he gave another small nod. "There's a rule," he said, his voice dropping lower. "One rule. We don't talk about before. Not my before, not yours. Laramie Fork, Hezekiah Burns. None of it. Those names don't get spoken here. You're not a runaway bride. I'm not a—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "We are just 2 people in a cabin. Nothing else. You understand?" "Yes," she said, the relief washing over her again, so strong her knees felt weak. "Yes, I understand." No past. It was the greatest gift he could have given her. She was not Maybelle Sims, the bartered daughter. She was just a person. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. "There's a needle and thread in that tin." He pointed to a small, rust-spotted biscuit tin on the shelf. "My shirt's torn, and the horse needs grain." He put on his hat, picked up his axe, and left the cabin. Maybelle watched him go. Then slowly, deliberately, she finished the piece of bread. The next few days fell into a strange, silent rhythm. The rule held. They did not speak of the past. In fact, they barely spoke at all. Their lives were dictated by the cold and the simple, pressing needs of survival. Eli would leave before dawn, his axe or his rifle in hand. He would return at dusk, sometimes with a rabbit or 2, which he would skin and clean with a frightening, detached efficiency. Maybelle worked. She moved her few belongings, the blanket and the knife she still kept hidden, to the small, dusty loft. It was warmer, the rising heat from the stove collecting under the eaves. She cooked their meals, simple, bland stews of salted bacon and beans, or the game Eli brought back. She learned to bank the fire, to make the coffee strong and hot for his return. She found the ripped shirt. It was heavy wool, stiff with dirt. She took the needle and thread. Her fingers, accustomed to fine embroidery, struggled with the coarse fabric. As she stitched the seam, she held the garment in her lap. It smelled of him, of pine, smoke, and a faint, masculine scent of sweat. It was an intimacy that startled her, and she found herself flushing, alone in the quiet cabin. She fed his horse, a big roan gelding with a mean streak. The horse clearly missed its master and eyed her with suspicion, but it took the oats from her hand, its warm breath fogging in the frigid barn air. Each small chore was a claim. She was earning her keep. One morning, the sun broke through the clouds, brilliant and blinding on the new snow. Eli was checking a trap line near the creek, and he motioned for her to follow. She had not been more than 100 yards from the cabin since her arrival. The air was still and bright. The creek was frozen at the edges, a ribbon of dark water gurgling beneath the ice. The silence of the high country was immense. It was not the empty silence of her locked room back home. It was a full, living silence, broken only by the caw of a raven and the crunch of their boots. He moved through the snow with a long, easy stride, his body economical, wasting no motion. He showed her how to spot the subtle dip in the snow that marked a hidden snare. He reset a trap, his gloved hands moving with speed and precision. He didn't speak, but he pointed, and he waited for her to watch. Maybelle stood beside him, breathing in the clean, sharp air. She looked out over the valley, a vast, untouched expanse of white and blue. There were no houses, no fences, no roads, no Hezekiah Burns, no mother weeping over ledgers. She felt something she had never felt before. It was not happiness. It was bigger than that. It was a raw, aching sense of freedom. She had nothing. She was wanted for theft, the theft of herself. She was cold and hungry and living in a stranger's cabin, and she had never felt so alive. That night, the feeling vanished. It started with a chill, a deep shaking she could not control. She blamed the cold in the loft. She piled more hay around her, but the shivering only worsened. By the time Eli returned, she was curled in a tight ball, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. He found her when he came to check the loft before turning in. He carried a lantern, and the light fell on her face. It was pale and beaded with sweat. "I'm just cold," she stammered. He put his hand on her forehead. His palm was rough, calloused, and shockingly warm. His touch was clinical, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her. "You're burning," he said. His voice was clipped. He frowned, a deep line forming between his brows. He was not angry. He looked inconvenienced, and perhaps, under that, something else, a flicker of concern. "It's the shoulder," he said, more to himself than to her. Her fall. The injury had festered. "You can't stay up here." Before she could protest, he bent down and slid one arm under her back and the other under her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Maybelle cried out, a small gasp of surprise and pain as her arm was jostled. Her father's coat fell away. She was in the ruined satin dress and her thin chemise. He carried her down the ladder and across the room to his own narrow cot by the stove. He laid her down gently. "You need to get out of that dress," he said, his voice flat. He turned his back to her, polite even in this, "And you need to get warm." Her fingers were numb, useless. She fumbled with the tiny buttons, but her hands were shaking too hard. She was weeping now, quiet, frustrated tears. "I can't." He turned back. He looked at her for a long second, his face grim. Then he knelt by the cot. "Move your arm." She did as she was told. His hands were not gentle, but they were efficient. He found the hidden knife in her pocket, pulled it out, and tossed it on the table. He didn't ask about it. He just worked, unlacing the back of the bodice, his fingers brushing her skin. Each touch was electric. She was hyper-aware of him, of his size, of the way he smelled. He pulled the heavy, ruined dress off her, leaving her in her thin, sweat-damp chemise. The cold of the room hit her skin, and she gasped. He pulled the blankets up to her chin. "Stay," he commanded. He stoked the fire until the stove was roaring. He melted snow in a pot and made her drink the hot water. The fever was climbing. She could feel it, a hot, disorienting fog rolling into her mind. The room began to spin. Eli stood watching her. She was shaking so hard the cot rattled. He cursed, a low, rough sound. He knew this kind of chill. It was the kind that killed. Blankets were not enough. He made a decision. It was pragmatic, devoid of emotion. He pulled off his boots, his heavy coat, and his gun belt. Then, fully clothed, he lifted the blankets and slid into the narrow cot beside her. Maybelle went rigid. A small sound of terror escaped her. "Be still," he ordered, his voice a low rumble in her ear. He pulled her back against his chest, trapping her between his body and the wall. He was like a furnace. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight, forcing his warmth into her. "It's the only way. Now, sleep." She was terrified. She was pressed against a strange man, a man who lived with a gun on his hip. But he was warm. His body was hard, unyielding, but it was solid. And the shaking, slowly, began to ease. She drifted into the fever. She was back in Laramie Fork. Her father was there, smelling of tobacco and horse. He was telling her it was all right, that she didn't have to marry anyone. She was crying, calling for him. "Papa," she whispered, the name a broken thing. "Papa, don't leave me, please." She felt a hand on her head, a large, rough hand, hesitating, then stroking her damp hair back from her face. It was not her father's hand, but it was kind. She turned her face into his chest, into the rough wool of his shirt, and wept. Eli lay rigid in the dark, his arms locked around the trembling woman. He listened to her call for her dead father. He felt her tears soak his shirt. He was a man who had built his life on solitude. He had not touched another human being in kindness in 5 years. His hand, of its own accord, continued to stroke her hair. He felt the fine, soft texture, the heat of her skin. He felt the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. He felt something, a terrible, aching pity, a dangerous tenderness. He held her, waiting for the fever to break. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about his own past. He was thinking of hers. She woke up in the cot, alone. The cabin was bright with sunlight. The fever was gone. Her body felt weak, boneless, but her mind was clear. She was wearing his shirt, a large gray flannel shirt that swallowed her. She had no memory of changing. Eli was sitting at the table, his back to her, cleaning his rifle. The familiar smell of gun oil hung in the air. "You're awake," he said, not turning. "Yes," her voice was a croak. "The fever." "It broke just before dawn," he said. "You've been sleeping for nearly a day." He finished with the rifle and began to reassemble it. The metallic clicks sharp in the quiet room. "There's broth on the stove." She sat up. The flannel shirt fell to her knees. She felt exposed, vulnerable. "My dress." "It's ruined. I burned it," he said. "The coat is there." She saw her father's coat, neatly folded on the chair, along with her mended boots. He had, she realized, undressed her, cleaned her, and dressed her in his own shirt while she was unconscious. The thought made her skin prickle. The distance between them was back, but it was different. It was charged. Before, it had been the silence of strangers. Now, it was the silence of two people who had shared something. They avoided looking at each other. The glances, when they happened, were longer. When he passed her the tin cup, his fingers brushed hers, and they both pulled back as if burned. When she cooked, she was aware of him watching her. She found herself noticing the way the muscles in his back moved when he split wood. the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he scanned the horizon. He was a hard man, but he had been gentle. The suppression of it made the air thick, hard to breathe. They were two people trapped in a small box by the snow, and the box was growing smaller every day. One evening, a few days later, they sat by the stove. The tension was unbearable. Maybelle was stitching a patch onto the knee of his denim trousers. The flannel shirt she wore was all she had besides the coat. She had to get out, just for a minute. I need to wash." He nodded, not looking up. "The creek's half frozen." "I'll heat water here," she said. She warmed water in the pot and took it, along with a bar of harsh lye soap and a rag, to the far corner of the cabin, behind a crude blanket he had hung for her privacy. She washed herself, the soap stinging her skin. As she dried, she looked down at her body in the dim lantern light. It was thinner, but stronger, and it was marked. The bruises from her fall were fading, turning a sickly yellow-green, but the other marks remained. Dark, ugly fingerprints on her ribs, a deep, purplish shadow on her shoulder. Not from the fall, but from a hand that had gripped her. Hard. It had been the final dress fitting. Hezekiah Burns had come. He wanted to inspect his purchase. The seamstress had protested, then fallen silent under his glare. He had put his hands on her, his thumbs pressing into her, testing the fit of the corset. His breath had been hot on her neck. Her mother had stood in the doorway and watched. Maybelle stared at the marks, and a cold, hard anger, an anger she had not allowed herself to feel, rose up in her. She stepped out from behind the blanket. Eli was still at the table, sharpening his skinning knife. She did not put the flannel shirt back on. She stood there in her thin chemise. "What happened to your shoulder was not just the fall," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Eli stopped sharpening the knife. He looked up, his eyes locking on hers. Then his gaze dropped. He saw the marks. He saw the dark, distinct bruises on her ribs and shoulder, stark against the pale skin of her chemise. His face, normally so controlled, went utterly blank. It was a terrifying stillness. He saw the shape of a man's hand on her. He looked back at her face, at her cold, steady gaze. He finally understood. He understood the hidden knife, the desperate ride into the storm, the terror that went beyond a simple unwillingness to be married. He said nothing. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He stood up slowly, the chair scraping loudly on the floor. He picked up his coat. "Eli," she said. He didn't look at her. He walked out of the cabin, slamming the door so hard the tins rattled on the shelves. Maybelle stood alone in the center of the room, shivering. She had misunderstood. He was not angry for her. He was disgusted by her. She was damaged goods, tainted. The realization brought a fresh wave of despair. He would make her leave now. He would cast her out, just like everyone else. She had nowhere to go. She sank onto the cot, her anger dissolving into a cold, hard knot of fear. She waited for hours. He did not return. Finally, she knew what she had to do. If she was to be cast out, she would not go without trying. She had one thing left to offer, the thing Burns had wanted, the thing her mother had sold. She put on her boots and her father's coat over her chemise. She grabbed the blanket from the cot. She found him in the barn. He was not sleeping. He was sitting on a hay bale, his back against a post, staring into the darkness. His gun belt was on his lap. "Eli," she said from the doorway. He turned his head. He looked tired. More than tired. He looked old. She walked toward him, her footsteps muffled by the hay. She stopped a few feet in front of him. She let the blanket fall from her shoulders. Then she unbuttoned her father's coat and let it slide to the ground. She stood before him in the freezing barn, in nothing but her thin cotton chemise. "You saw the marks," she said. Her voice was shaking, but she forced it to be steady. "He did that. He wanted to make sure the fit was right. Eli closed his eyes. "Put your coat on, Maybelle." "No," she said. She took a step closer. "I am not what you think I am. I am not clean. I was going to be his. Now I am nothing. But I am not a virgin tonight. I won't be." She reached out a trembling hand and touched his chest. He was rigid. "Please," she whispered, the last of her pride breaking. "Just do it. Make it real. Don't make me be nothing." She was offering herself, the only currency she had. Eli's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was steel. He stared at her, his eyes black and unreadable in the dark. A violent tremor ran through his entire body. He wanted to, God help him, he wanted to. He wanted to take her and erase the marks of that other man, to brand her as his own. He pulled her. She fell against him, onto his lap. He was hard and strong. His other hand came up, burying itself in her hair, tilting her head back. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his hot, ragged breath. She closed her eyes, waiting for the roughness, the pain. And then, nothing. The tremor passed. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The hand in her hair did not pull, it just held. The hand on her wrist loosened. He did not kiss her. He did not tear her chemise. He just pulled her head down against his shoulder and wrapped both arms around her, crushing her to his chest. He held her with a desperate, shaking strength, his face buried in her hair. She was so stunned she could not move. He was just holding her. "You are not nothing," he whispered, his voice thick, unrecognizable. "You are not." He held her for a long time as she began to cry, silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. He held her until she was spent. He reached down, picked up her father's coat, and wrapped it around her. Then he pulled the wool blanket over both of them. They did not go back to the cabin. They slept there, in the hay, their bodies pressed together for warmth. His arms never loosened. They lay tangled together, their foreheads touching. Two broken people finding a fragile peace in the dark. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had. The sun rose on a world of sharp edges and brittle light. Maybelle woke first. She was still in the hay, wrapped in her father's coat, the heavy wool blanket covering them both. Eli was asleep, his arms still draped possessively over her waist, his face turned toward her. In sleep, the hardness was gone. The lines of tension around his mouth and eyes were soft. He looked younger, almost peaceful. She watched the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. She had cried herself to sleep against that chest, and he had not let her go. He had held her, his hand rubbing slow, comforting circles on her back until her sobs quieted. He had not taken what she offered. He had given her warmth, and something she could not name. Respect, perhaps. A sudden, hot wave of shame washed over her. She had thrown herself at him. She had offered her body, begged him to take it, like a whore in the Laramie saloon. And he, this quiet, hard stranger, had refused. He had simply held her. She slid out from under his arm, moving with agonizing slowness. He stirred, his brow furrowing, but he did not wake. She grabbed her boots and fled the barn, her heart pounding. She ran through the snow to the cabin, her cheeks burning despite the frigid air. She slammed the door, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The small, one-room cabin felt like a refuge. She poked the embers in the stove, adding kindling until a small fire caught. She needed to do something, to make herself useful, to erase the memory of her own desperate weakness. When Eli entered the cabin 20 minutes later, she had coffee boiling and was slicing bacon into a pan. She did not look at him. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the space he took up in the small room. He stopped just inside the door, stamping the snow from his boots. The silence was heavier than the snow outside. It was not the quiet, working silence of the days before. It was a brittle, awkward thing, full of unsaid words. He cleared his throat. "Coffee's hot." "It is," she said, her voice small, her eyes fixed on the sizzling bacon. He walked to the stove, poured a cup, and retreated to the other side of the room. He stood by the frosted window, staring out, his back to her. She could feel his gaze on her, even when he was not looking. She fumbled the knife, dropping it with a clatter. "Damn it," she whispered, bending to retrieve it. "You're favoring your left arm again," he said, his voice flat. "It's nothing, just stiff from the cold." "Right." He drank his coffee. The silence stretched again, pulled thin and tight. Neither of them mentioned the barn. Neither of them mentioned her tears, or his arms around her, or the fact that they had slept tangled together like man and wife. While nothing at all had happened, the night in the hay was a ghost in the room, and they both refused to look at it. She served the bacon and the last of the bread. They ate, standing on opposite sides of the room, like two wary wolves sharing a kill. The tension was broken by the sound of a horse. It was not Eli's roan, which was safe in the barn. This was a new sound, a horse moving slowly, picking its way through the snow-covered rocks at the edge of the property. Eli's head snapped up. In one fluid motion, he set his cup down, grabbed his rifle from the wall, and checked the load. "Get in the loft," he said. His voice was no longer awkward. It was the voice of the man from the first night, cold, sharp, and dangerous. "What is it?" "Don't talk. Move." She scrambled up the ladder as he slipped out the cabin door, moving low and fast, disappearing into the line of pines that fringed the clearing. Maybelle lay flat on the hay, peering through a wide crack in the cabin's gable. She could see the valley below. A man on a horse, a stocky man in a heavy buffalo coat, was sitting just beyond the broken fence line. He was staring at the cabin, staring at the smoke that rose from the chimney. He was one of Burns's men. She recognized him. His name was Jeb, a man known for his quick temper and his loyalty to Hezekiah Burns's wallet. He sat there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, his horse pawing nervously at the snow. He was clearly suspicious. This ranch was supposed to be empty. Then, a voice cut through the cold. Still air. Eli's voice. It seemed to come from the rocks themselves, from everywhere at once. "That's far enough." Jeb started, his hand flying to the pistol on his hip. "Who's there? Show yourself!" "You're on private land." Eli called out. He was invisible. "Turn around." "This is Burns' property," Jeb shouted, his confidence returning. "We're looking for something that belongs to him. A girl." "There's no girl here," Eli's voice replied, flat and dead. "Just me, and I don't like visitors." "That's fresh smoke," Jeb argued, gesturing with his chin toward the cabin. "You ain't no ghost. You come out now, or I'm coming in." He nudged his horse forward, his hand still on his gun. A shot exploded through the valley. It was deafening. The bullet didn't hit Jeb. It hit the trunk of a pine tree not 6 inches from his head, showering his face with splinters of bark and snow. Jeb's horse screamed and reared, nearly throwing him. He fought the animal for a moment, his face pale with shock. "The next one," Eli's voice echoed, calm and lethal. "Won't be for the tree. Get—" Jeb didn't need to be told a third time. He yanked his horse's head around, dug his heels into its flanks, and galloped away, sliding and scrambling back down the trail he had made. Maybelle let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her entire body was shaking. Eli did not return for almost an hour. When he did, his face was a grim mask. He didn't put the rifle back on the wall. He leaned it by the door. "He's gone," Maybelle said, climbing down from the loft. "He's gone back to town," Eli corrected her. "He'll tell Burns he found smoke. He'll tell him a man with a rifle fired on him. They'll put 2 and 2 together. They'll be back. Not 1 man, 12, maybe more." He turned to face her. The awkwardness of the morning was gone, burned away by the adrenaline. You have to leave, he said. Leave? The word felt like a stone in her mouth. Leave? Where? They'll find me. I'll freeze. It's your only chance, Eli said, his voice hard. You follow the creek up into the high country. It'll be hard travel, but it'll take you over the pass into the next territory. Maybe you can find a town, a homestead, get work, change your name, but you can't stay here. I can't protect you from a dozen men. He was casting her out, after all. The realization was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. She had brought this on him. This was her fault. You're making me go, she whispered. His face softened, just for a second. I'm giving you a choice. I'm telling you what's coming. You can ride west, and maybe you'll make it. Or you can ride east, back to Laramie Fork, back to him. That's your choice. She looked at him, at his hard face, at the rifle leaning by the door. He was a man who lived by facts, and the fact was, she was trouble, and he was through with it. And you? She asked. What will you do? I'll be gone by nightfall, heading north. They can have this place. He was running, too. They were two runners. She stood very still. She thought of the ride into the high country, alone, with no food and a winter storm brewing. She thought of the pass, of the wolves, of freezing to death in a snowdrift. She thought of Laramie Fork, of Hezekiah Burns's wet mouth and the bruises he had left on her. Then she looked at Eli. He had held her while she cried. He had fired his rifle to protect her. He was hard, and he was cold, but he was the first man in her entire life who had been honest with her. No, she said. He frowned. No? What does that mean? No, you won't go west. It means no, I won't go at all. That's not a choice. Maybelle, that's suicide. They will come. Then let them come, she said, and she was surprised by the strength in her own voice. You said I had a choice. Go west and die, go east and die. Or I can stay. I have nothing. Eli, no family, no home, no name I care about. My mother sold me, the man who bought me. She spat the word. Wants to break me. I've been running my whole life. From my mother's fears, from my father's debts. I ran from that town. I am done running. She took a step toward him. You said you were heading north. Take me with you. I travel light, he said, his voice rough. And I travel alone. I can keep up. I can work. You know I can. Or we can stay. Right here. This is your home. Why should you run? We can fight them. He stared at her as if she were insane. Fight them? A dozen men with one rifle and a pistol? That's not a fight. That's a massacre. I have a knife, she said, her chin high. He almost smiled. It was a grim, bitter twitch of his lips. A knife, against a dozen rifles. He shook his head. You don't know what these men are. I know what Hezekiah Burns is, she countered, her voice dropping. And I would rather die here, with you, than live one day as his wife. So that's my choice. I'm staying. You can go north if you want, but I am staying. She had laid her last card on the table. She watched his face, her heart hammering. He looked at her for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at her defiant, terrified eyes. He looked at her standing there in his flannel shirt, her small frame braced for a blow. He saw the marks on her in his mind. And he, a man who had survived for 5 years by running, by staying solitary, by never, ever choosing another person's fight, knew he was trapped, not by her, but by himself. He let out a long breath. You are, he said, the biggest fool I have ever met. He turned and looked out the window. The sky to the west, which had been clear, was now a deep, bruised purple. The wind was picking up, and the fine, granular snow that had been on the ground was beginning to move, snaking across the clearing in long, white ribbons. And it doesn't matter anyway, he said, his voice flat. He's not sending his men today. How do you know? Look at the sky, Eli said. A real storm is coming. A blizzard. Even Burns won't send his men into this. We're safe from him. For now. Then we're safe. He turned back to her, his eyes dark. We're safe from him, but we're trapped, you and me, in this cabin, until it passes. And a storm like this, it could be 2 days, it could be 5. The implication hung in the small, hot room, the awkwardness of the morning, the tension of the henchmen. All of it paled. They were prisoners, not of Burns, but of the weather. The storm hit an hour later. It did not arrive gently. It came like an avalanche, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind did not howl. It screamed. It was a solid physical force that hammered the cabin, searching for every crack. Snow began to pile in deep drifts against the door and the one small window. The light inside the cabin dimmed, turning a sickly gray yellow. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the small room. For the first day, they barely spoke. They moved around each other, tending the fire, melting snow for water, checking on the horse. The tension from the barn was back, magnified 100 times by the confinement. The cabin was too small. He was too large. His presence filled it. Eli slept on the floor by the door, his rifle beside him. Maybelle took the cot. She would lie awake for hours, listening to the roar of the wind and the sound of his breathing, just a few feet away. By the second day, the air was thick, hard to breathe. They were restless. Eli would stand for an hour at a time, staring out the tiny, frosted-over window at the white chaos. His shoulders bunched. Maybelle found herself pacing, 2 steps one way, 2 steps the other, until he finally growled. "Be still." She snapped back. "I can't. This is—" "I know what it is," he said. They fell silent again. Every small noise was amplified. The crackle of the fire, the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the scrape of a tin cup on the table. He chopped wood from the small pile he kept inside. The thwack of the axe, a punctuation to the screaming wind. She restitched every piece of clothing they owned, her hands needing to be busy. The intimacy of their confinement was suffocating. She knew how he took his coffee. He knew she hummed, a low, tuneless sound. When she was nervous, she watched his hands as he mended a piece of his horse's tackle, noticing the long, calloused fingers, the way they moved with such deftness. He watched her as she banked the fire, the red light catching the soft curve of her cheek. They were orbiting each other, 2 planets held in a tight, angry gravity. The air crackled, the night in the barn. His rejection of her was a live thing between them. On the 3rd night, the storm reached its peak. The wind sounded like a freight train trying to tear the roof from the cabin. They had eaten a meager, silent meal of beans. Eli was sitting on the floor, his back to the wall, mending his shirt, the one he had given her to wear after her fever. He was stitching a patch onto the elbow by the dim light of the lantern. Maybelle had heated water and taken it behind the blanket screen. The confinement was making her feel grimy, her skin crawling. She washed herself quickly, the water growing cold almost instantly. She stood behind the screen, her chemise clinging to her damp skin. She was cold, she was tired, and she was stretched to the breaking point. She was tired of the silence, tired of the fear, tired of him sitting 3 feet away, pretending she was not there. He had refused her when she offered herself in shame. What would he do if she offered herself in strength? She made a decision. She did not put the flannel shirt on. She did not put her father's coat on. She picked up the blanket from her cot, wrapped it around herself, and stepped out from behind the screen. He looked up, his fingers stilled on the shirt. His eyes raked over her. The blanket was draped over one shoulder, her skin bare beneath it. Her hair was damp, curling around her face. "You should get dressed," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You'll catch your death." He looked back down at his sewing, his knuckles white. She did not move. "I'm not cold." She walked toward him, She stopped directly in front of him. So close her knees were almost touching his. He was forced to look up. "Maybelle," he warned. "I am not afraid of you, Eli," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with a force she did not know she possessed. "I'm not afraid of this storm, and I'm not afraid of Hezekiah Burns." She reached out a trembling hand and placed it flat against his chest. His heart leaped under her palm, a hard, frantic beat. He sucked in a sharp breath. His eyes, fixed on hers, were black, the pupils blown wide. "You should be," he whispered. His voice choked. "You should be afraid of me." "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked. "Are you going to send me away? You had the chance. You didn't." She did not move her hand. She just held it there, her touch a brand on his skin. He stared at her hand, then at her face. He was at war with himself. She saw the fight in his eyes, the deep animal want, and the harder, colder line of his control. And she saw his control break. He dropped the shirt. His hand came up, not to push her away, but to cover hers, his fingers lacing with hers, pressing her palm harder against his heart. His other hand shot to her waist, grabbing the blanket, pulling her down. She fell against him, and his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an explosion. It was all the confinement, all the fear, all the suppressed longing of the last few days. It was rough and desperate and hungry. His stubble raked her skin. He tasted of coffee and smoke. He kissed her like he was starving, and she kissed him back with the same desperation. She was not a victim. She was a participant. Her free hand came up, tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. He groaned, a low sound from deep in his chest. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his forehead pressed against hers. "Not here," he panted. The room was too small, the stove too hot. He stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't let go of her hand. He grabbed his coat from the wall and threw it around her. Over the blanket, he jammed his feet into his boots. "Where?" she whispered. "The barn." He opened the cabin door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the wall. The world was a screaming vortex of white. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her out into it. The cold was a physical blow. It stole their breath. The snow was waist deep, but he plunged through it, pulling her behind him. They could not see. They could not hear. They were blind and deaf in the heart of the storm. He found the barn by memory. He kicked the small side door open and dragged her inside. The barn was a different world. It was almost silent. The wind screamed high overhead, but inside, the air was still cold and heavy with the smell of hay and the warm, living scent of his horse. He didn't let her go. He kicked the door shut, plunging them into near total darkness. He backed her against the wall, his mouth finding hers again. "Here," he whispered against her lips. "This is ours." He half carried, half dragged her to the hayloft, the place where they had slept. He threw down the coat, the blanket. He tore at his own clothes. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a fumbling, frantic, desperate coming together. It was raw, and it was clumsy, and it was confused. His hands were everywhere, learning the shape of her, and hers were just as eager, rediscovering him. It was the first time for her, and in some ways, it was the first time for him. It was rough, born of a need that went beyond the physical. It was a defiant act against the storm, against Hezekiah Burns, against the past that had tried to destroy them both. He took her, and she took him, and it was a claiming. But in the middle of the raw hunger, there was a sudden, shocking tenderness. He stopped, bracing himself above her. He pushed the damp hair back from her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her in the darkness, his eyes seeming to bore into her. He was seeing her, all of her. "Maybelle," he whispered, her name a prayer. And when he moved again, it was no longer rough. It was a slow, deliberate, deep joining. It was a promise, She cried out, a sharp sound that was part pain, part pleasure, part release. Afterward, they lay tangled in the hay, in the coats and blankets. The adrenaline faded, and the overwhelming reality of what they had done settled over them. Maybelle began to shake, a deep, uncontrollable tremor. Then the tears came, not the broken, fearful sobs of the night before. These were deep, shuddering tears, a release of all the tension, all the fear, all the years of being held down. Eli didn't speak. He just pulled her close, his arms locking around her. He wrapped the blankets tightly, covering her bare skin, pulling her head onto his chest. He held her, his hand stroking her back, his chin resting on the top of her head. He let her cry until she was empty. She finally quieted, her breath catching in small, hiccuping sobs. She felt spent and raw and incredibly, terrifyingly safe. She felt his lips press against her hair. "I'm scared of this too," he whispered, his voice thick, and she knew he was not talking about the storm. The blizzard lasted 5 days. On the 6th morning, the world was born anew. They woke in the loft, tangled in the blankets, to a silence so profound it was almost deafening. The wind was gone. Eli moved first. He rose and went to the small, snow-clogged window. He scraped the frost away with his fingernail. Outside, the world was a blinding, pristine white. The sun was so bright on the snow it hurt the eyes. The sky was a deep, painful blue. "It broke," he said. His voice was quiet in the stillness. They went back to the cabin, pushing through snow that was drifted to their waists. The small room felt different. It was no longer a prison. It was a refuge. The rule of silence was gone, shattered in the barn along with their solitude. They moved around each other with a new, shy awareness. The cot was too narrow for one, let alone two, so Eli moved his bedroll to the floor, close to the stove, and Maybelle, without a word, laid hers down beside it. They began to talk. It did not happen all at once. It happened in the quiet moments, while she made coffee, or while he cleaned his rifle, or in the long, dark evenings before they slept. The shared intimacy of the storm had unlocked something in them both. They had shared a bed. Now they could share a past. He spoke first. He was staring into the flames of the stove, his face illuminated by the red glow. "I wasn't always here," he said, his voice low. This is a place to hide." Maybelle sat on her bedroll, mending his coat. She kept her eyes on her work, her hands still, waiting. "I was a drover, down in Texas near Sweetwater, 10 years ago. I was just a kid, 21. He paused, his memory drifting. "There was a girl, Clara. She worked in the saloon." He described her, small, with yellow hair and a cough that never seemed to leave her. "The saloon owner, Finney. He was a big man, owned half the town, and he owned her. He'd beat her. Not where folks could see, but we all knew. You could see it in her eyes." Eli's voice went flat. "One night, I heard her scream. In the alley behind the saloon. He was hurting her, badly. I told him to let her go." Eli looked at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "Finney laughed. He pulled a knife. He was a bull of a man. He came at me. I had my skinning knife. It was him or me." He went quiet for a long time. Maybelle didn't breathe. "I was faster," Eli finished, his voice a whisper. "I killed him. The knife went in. It just went in. The sheriff came. He knew what Finney was. He knew it was self-defense. But Finney had family, powerful family. They owned the bank. They owned the judge. They wanted a hanging. My hanging." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small, warm room. "The sheriff. He unlocked my cell in the middle of the night. He gave me my gun and told me to ride north. He said he'd tell them I escaped. He said, 'I'm protecting the peace, son. Now get.' So I ran. I've been running ever since. The charge is murder." He let out a long, shuddering breath. So now you know. I'm a killer." Maybelle put the coat down. She looked at this man who had held her, who had been gentle with her, who had risked his life to fire a warning shot for her. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You're a protector. You saved her." He looked at her, his eyes full of a decade of loneliness and guilt. "Now it's my turn," she said. She told him about the dress fitting. She told him about the seamstress and the smell of whiskey and cloves. She told him about Burns's hands, his thumbs pressing into her ribs, the way he'd leaned in and whispered in her ear. He said a man has a right to inspect his property before the bill of sale is final. Eli's body went so still he looked like he was carved from stone. A low, animal sound rumbled in his chest. "And my mother," Maybelle said, the last, most bitter truth. "She was in the doorway. She saw it. She saw his hands on me. She saw my face. And she just turned, and she closed the door. She left me alone with him. She locked the door." She was weeping now, the shame and rage of it burning her throat. "She sold me, and then she locked the door." Eli moved. He crossed the small space in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. He didn't pull her into his arms. He just took her hands, his grip so tight it was painful. He held her hands, grounding her, his eyes locked on hers, his own face a mask of such fury that it frightened her. "He will never," Eli said, his voice a low, terrifying promise, "touch you again. I swear on my own grave. He will never touch you again." The confessions broke the last barrier. They were no longer 2 strangers. They were Eli and Maybelle. They were outcasts, bound by the sins of others. The next few days were quiet. They settled into a domesticity that was so new, so fragile. It felt like a dream. They would wake up together on the floor, his arm heavy over her. She would make coffee while he went out into the brilliant, cold morning to check his traps. They ate their meals together at the small table. He even smiled, a small, unused expression that lit his face when she accidentally burned the bacon. They started to dream. "When this is over," he said one morning. They were standing outside the cabin, the air sharp and clean. "When Burns gives up." "A man like him doesn't give up," she said. "He can't search forever. He'll assume you're dead, frozen in the storm. We'll wait until spring, when the pass is clear." "The pass?" "North," he said, gesturing to the high, snow-covered peaks. "Montana. My father had a claim, years ago, before it's high country. Near the Flathead, good water, tall trees. A man could build a cabin there. A man could disappear. A family could start fresh." He looked at her, the question clear in his eyes. "A family." The word hung in the air. A small, warm thing. Maybelle felt a tightness in her chest, but this time, it was not fear. It was hope. She saw it, a small cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, a life built with their own hands, a life where no one was running. "Montana," she whispered, testing the word. "I'd like that. Eli, I'd like that very much." The dream held them for 3 days. On the 4th day, the real world came back. "We're almost out," Eli said, tapping the near-empty coffee tin. "Flour's low, so is the salt, and we're almost out of cartridges." A cold dread settled in her stomach. "You can't go to town." "Not Laramie Fork," he agreed. "But there's a trading post at Rock Creek. To the south, it's just a junction. No one knows me there. But Jeb, that man—" "He saw a shadow in the trees. He didn't see my face. I'll be fine. I also need to trade the roan." "Trade your horse?" "He's a good horse," Eli said, his face grim. "But he's known in Laramie. Burns's men will know that horse. We need fresh mounts, 2 of them. Something strong that no one's seen before." He was planning for their escape. For Montana. "I have to go," he said. "It's the only way." He left before dawn. Maybelle stood at the door, her father's coat wrapped tight around her. "I'll be back by dark," he said. He leaned down from the saddle. He hesitated. Then his hand came up and cupped her jaw. His thumb brushed her cheek. It was not a kiss. It was a promise. "Bar the door. Don't light the stove. Don't make a sound, no matter what." She nodded, unable to speak. He turned the roan and rode out, disappearing into the blinding white. Maybelle barred the door. The cabin, once their refuge, became her prison again. The silence was absolute. Every snap of a frozen branch, every caw of a raven, sounded like a hoofbeat. She sat on the bedroll, her father's old knife in her lap, and she waited. The sun touched the western peaks, painting the snow pink, then purple. Darkness fell. He was not back. She strained, listening, nothing but the low moan of the wind. An hour passed, then two. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat. He should have been back. He was a man who understood time and light. He was late. She was pacing, her hands clenched, when she finally heard it, the muffled sound of a horse, moving slowly, tiredly. She ran to the door, her hand on the heavy wooden bar. "Eli," she called out, her voice a strained whisper. "It's me. Open it." She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking, and threw the door open. He nearly fell inside. He was not on the roan. He was on a dark bay mare, and he was leading a second, smaller buckskin. He slid from the saddle, stumbling, and pushed the door shut, leaning back against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're late," she said, her voice trembling. "Trouble," he said, his voice thick. "Eli, you're hurt." In the dim light from the embers, she saw the dark, wet stain soaking his left sleeve, high up by the shoulder. "It's just a graze," he gritted, pushing himself off the wall. "But we have to go, now." "What happened? Who saw you?" "Burns," he said, his voice full of a cold, new anger. "He's smarter than I thought. He posted a reward, not just for you, for any information on the squatter who fired on his man. $500. Maybelle gasped. It was a fortune, enough to make any man talk. "A trapper," Eli continued, walking stiffly to the table and grabbing the sack he'd thrown down. "A man I've seen at Rock Creek before. He must have recognized me from the description Jeb gave. He saw his payday. He told 2 of Burns's hired guns. They were at the trading post, waiting." He tore open the sack. "They waited for me on the trail out, ambushed me, 3 of them. My God, Eli, I was ready for them," he said, his voice grim. He pulled out a box of cartridges. "But they were ready for me. We traded shots. This," he motioned to his arm, "was a lucky one. I lost them in the canyons, but they know the general direction I came from. They'll find this place by morning." He looked at her, his eyes dark and urgent. "Flour, bacon, coffee, ammunition. Get your coat. Get the blankets. We're leaving. We're leaving tonight." There was no time for fear. There was only time for motion. While Eli quickly and efficiently saddled the 2 new horses, Maybelle packed. She grabbed the blankets, the tin coffee pot, the skillet, the food. She stuffed it all into a canvas sack. He came back inside. "Help me with this." She turned. He was holding his arm, and blood was dripping steadily from his fingertips. She ran to him. "It's not just a graze. It'll hold. I need a bandage. Tight." She grabbed her father's knife from her belt. She didn't hesitate. She ripped a long, clean strip from the bottom of her only chemise. She wrapped it around his bicep, her hands sure and steady. She pulled the knot so tight he hissed in pain. "Good," he said. He put his coat back on. "Let's ride." They mounted. He took the lead, not north toward Montana. That way was too open, too clear in the moonlight. He turned them west, into the deep, broken badlands. A maze of canyons and sheer rock walls, a place to hide. They rode for 2 hours. The moon was a cold, silver dollar in the sky, illuminating the snow-covered rocks, making them perfect targets. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a rifle. The shot came from the ridge above them. The crack of the rifle was deafening, echoing and bouncing off the canyon walls until it sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Maybelle screamed as the horse beside her, Eli's horse, stumbled and went to its knees. "Eli!" "They found us!" he yelled. He hauled the mare to its feet. "Ride, Maybelle! Ride! Don't stop!" Another shot. This one was closer. It whined off the rock face just in front of her. Her horse reared, terrified. She lost the reins. She was frozen. Eli slammed his horse into hers, his hands shooting out, grabbing her reins. "Go!" A third shot. Eli grunted. It was not a word. It was a sound, a sharp, choked punch of air. He was between her and the ridge. He had put himself there. "Eli!" she screamed. He didn't answer. He just yanked her horse's head, forcing it forward, into a narrow split in the rock, a dark game trail. "Go! Go!" he roared, his voice thick and wet. And then he fell. He didn't slide from the saddle. He fell, a dead weight, collapsing onto the frozen ground. "No." Maybelle pulled her horse to a stop, jumping from the saddle. She ran to him. "Get on the horse!" He gasped from the snow. "Take them! Leave me! Ride!" "I am not leaving you!" she shrieked, grabbing him under the arms. Another shot kicked up dust near her feet. They were zeroing in. "Eli, get up! Please get up!" She tried to pull him. He was too heavy. He was all dead weight. "I can't," he whispered. "My back. He shot me in the back." She saw it then. The moonlight was bright on the snow. The back of his heavy wool coat was black and wet. A dark, viscous pool was spreading out from under him. "No, no, no!" She ran to his horse, grabbing the reins. "You have to get on. You have to—" Adrenaline, born of pure terror and rage, surged through her. She hauled him up. He screamed, a high, thin sound that tore the night in two. She ignored it. She shoved him, half prostrate, over the saddle. He was barely conscious. She grabbed the reins of both horses and plunged into the narrow canyon, into the darkness, dragging his mount behind her. Shots rang out, but they were lost, swallowed by the twisting rock walls. She ran. She ran until her lungs burned and the horses were lathered in sweat. She ran for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper into the maze. She had to stop. Eli was groaning, a low, continuous sound, and she could hear him sliding from the saddle. She found a small overhang, a place where the canyon wall had been hollowed out by ancient floods. It was shallow, but it was dark. It was out of the moonlight. It was a place to hide. She pulled him from the horse. He fell into her arms, a terrible, limp weight. "Eli, Eli, stay with me, please. Talk to me." "Cold," he whispered. His teeth were chattering. "So cold." Shock. She knew the signs. She tied the horses. She pulled the blankets from the saddle roll. She spread one on the frozen, rocky ground and eased him onto it, covering him with the other two. She needed a fire. She had to see the wound. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely strike the match. She gathered a few dry twigs from the base of the overhang. The small fire caught. A tiny, dangerous, blessed light. She pulled open his coat. The back of his shirt was a solid mass of blood. She pulled his knife from his belt. Her hands were slick with his blood. She cut the shirt away. The firelight was small, but it was enough. She saw the hole. It was high on his back, just to the right of his spine. There was no exit wound. The bullet was inside him, deep. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, Eli." He was shivering, a deep, convulsive shaking that rattled his whole body. She had to clean it. She had water in the canteen. She tore another strip from her chemise. She poured the icy water onto the cloth and pressed it to the wound. Eli arched off the ground, a raw, strangled cry tearing from his throat, before he fell back, unconscious. "I'm sorry," she wept, the tears freezing on her face. "I'm so sorry, Eli." There was nothing else to do. She couldn't get the bullet out. She could only try to stop the bleeding. She pressed the cleanest part of the cloth hard against the hole. Her hand, her arm, her whole body shaking. She sat there, in the dark, in the frozen canyon, her hand pressed against his back, trying to hold his life inside him. The tiny fire sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows. Her throat was parched, raw with thirst and fear. She listened to the silence, listening for the sound of hoofbeats, and prayed for the sun to come up. Dawn broke gray and brutal. The fire was dead. There was only a handful of ashes, a few charred twigs. Eli was on his back, his body rigid, his skin a pale, waxy color in the thin light. He was alive. His breathing was a shallow, ragged hitch in his chest. Maybelle touched his forehead. He was burning, a dry, searing heat that radiated from his skin. The cold of the canyon had kept the fever at bay for a few hours. But now, with the sun rising, the infection was taking hold. "Eli?" she whispered, shaking his good shoulder. "Eli, wake up." His eyes fluttered open, but they were not his eyes. They were milky, unfocused. They looked through her. "Clara," he mumbled, his voice a dry rasp. They're waiting. Finney, he's at the door. Get out the back." "No, Eli, it's me. It's Maybelle." She was frantic, her voice sharp with terror. "Clara's not here." "Gotta ride north," he continued, his body beginning to tremble, not with cold, but with a deep, internal ague. "Sheriff, said ride. Can't stop. Can't," he groaned, a low, animal sound, and his back arched slightly, a spasm of pain from the wound. She knew this fever. She had seen it take her father after he was gored by a bull. It was a fire that burned from the inside out, a fire that consumed the mind and then the man. The bandage she had made was soaked through. The wound itself, when she peeled the cloth back, was a nightmare. It was purple and swollen, the edges an angry, inflamed red. He needed medicine, not just willow bark for the fever. He needed something to clean the wound. She remembered his words. Rock Creek, the trading post. It was south. It was where he had been ambushed. But it was the only place. She looked at the sun. It was maybe 7 in the morning. "I'll be back, Eli," she whispered to the delirious man. "I promise. You just hold on." She couldn't leave him exposed. She hauled him, his body limp and terrifyingly light, deeper under the overhang. She covered him with all 3 blankets, piling rocks and brush at the opening to hide him and break the wind. He was mumbling, lost in his 10-year-old nightmare. She took the bay mare. The buckskin was smaller, but the bay looked stronger, faster. She mounted, her hands shaking, her throat so dry it felt like it was full of sand. She looked back once at the pathetic pile of rocks and blankets. Then she dug her heels into the horse's flanks and rode. She rode with a reckless panic, pushing the horse harder than she should have. She had no idea where the trading post was, only that it was south. She followed the canyon, praying it would lead her out, praying she wouldn't meet Burns's men. The canyon opened into a wide, snow-covered plain. In the distance, she saw a dark ribbon of water, fringed with cottonwoods, a creek, Rock Creek. She followed it. The tracks from the ambush were there, confused and bloody in the snow. She saw where Eli's roan had fallen, where he had mounted the bay. She saw the tracks of the other 3 men, fanning out, searching. They had lost him in the canyons, just as he'd said. But they had not gone back to Laramie. They were still searching. She forced the thought down. She rode for what felt like hours. The sun climbing high, the creek was wide, and the crossing was a treacherous mess of ice and black, rushing water. The trail led across it. The horse balked, rearing as its hooves touched the moving water. "No, you have to," she hissed, kicking it hard. "Go!" The mare lunged. The ice broke. They were in the water. It was so cold it was like fire. It surged around her legs, soaking her boots, her father's coat. Instantly, the current was strong, pulling at them, the horse struggling for footing on the slick, rocky bottom. Maybelle cried out as the water reached her waist, the cold sucking the breath from her body. The horse lunged one last time, its hooves finding purchase, and scrambled up the far bank, shaking, its coat instantly freezing in the air. She was numb from the waist down. She knew she had to keep moving or she would die. She kicked the half-frozen horse into a stumbling trot. She found the trading post an hour later. It was just two long, low buildings of sod and log, a place for trappers to sell their pelts and get drunk. It was also, she saw with a sinking heart, ransacked. The door was kicked in, barrels were overturned, sacks of flour and sugar were split open, their contents mingling with the mud and snow on the floor. Burns' men! They had come here looking for the trapper who had warned Eli. "No," she whispered, her teeth chattering. She slid from the horse and stumbled inside. There was nothing. They had taken everything. She was frantic, tearing through the debris. In a back room, a small storage area, she found a wooden crate that had been overlooked. Inside, beneath a moldy bearskin, was a small tin box. She opened it with numb fingers, a tin of carbolic salve, a twist of dried willow bark, and a half-full bottle of whiskey. It was everything. She shoved the items inside her coat, her heart hammering with a wild, desperate hope. She ran back outside, to her horse. A low growl stopped her. She froze. Not 20 yards away, standing between her and the horse, was a wolf. It was a large, gray male, its ribs stark beneath its thin winter coat. It was gaunt, starving, and it was looking at her. Its yellow eyes were flat, devoid of fear. She had her knife. It was still in her belt, the one her father had used for skinning. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it. "Go on," she whispered, her voice a pathetic squeak. "Get." The wolf took a slow, deliberate step toward her. It was not afraid of her. It was desperate. She took a step back, her heel hitting the log wall of the trading post. She was trapped. The wolf crouched, its muscles tensing for a spring. A single deafening shot split the air. The wolf collapsed. It didn't yelp. It just fell, a plume of red blossoming on the white snow behind its head. Maybelle screamed, her legs giving way. She slid down the wall, the knife clattering from her hand. "You should know better than to sneak up on a wolf's meal, girl." The voice was old, like dry leaves skittering over rock. A man emerged from the cottonwoods, a long rifle smoking in his hands. He was old, impossibly old, his face a map of wrinkles, his beard a tangle of white and gray. He wore greasy buckskins and a heavy fur hat. He walked over to the wolf, nudged it with his boot, and then turned his pale, ice-blue eyes on her. "Who in the hell are you?" he asked. "And what are you doing at my post?" Your post?" Maybelle stammered. They ransacked it." "Burns' men." The old man spat. "I saw 'em. I've been watching for 2 days, waiting for 'em to leave. Now, I ask again, who are you?" My name is Maybelle. I'm with a man. He's hurt, shot. He was here yesterday. He said his name was Eli." The old trapper's face changed. The suspicion faded, replaced by something she could not read. Recognition. "Eli," the man said, his voice softer. "He's alive? I heard the shots. I figured they'd got him." "He's shot in the back. He's in the canyon. He has a fever." The old man stared at her, his eyes seeming to look straight through her. You're the girl. Then, the one Burns is huntin'. The one Eli's protectin'. You know him? Maybelle pleaded, scrambling to her feet. Know him? The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. I reckon I do. I'm Silas. I found that boy 10 years ago, half-starved and near dead from exposure, just north of the Platte. He'd been running for a month straight from Texas. He was just a pup. He worked my trap lines for a year before he moved on. He's the closest thing to a son I ever had. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. And he's shot in the back, you say? Yes, please, we have to hurry. He's burning up. All right, girl. All right. Settle your mind. Silas whistled, and a mule stepped out from the trees, placid and gray. My cabin's closer, hidden. They'll never find it. We'll fetch him, and we'll get that bullet out. They moved Eli in the twilight. Silas brought a travois, and together they loaded Eli's limp body onto it. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin a terrifying, mottled red. Silas's cabin was a miracle. It was dug into the side of a hill, its front made of logs, its roof covered in sod. It was invisible until you were 10 feet from it. Inside, it was one room, warm, and smelled of smoke, herbs, and dried meat. A fire blazed in a stone hearth. Get him on the cot, Silas commanded, and get that whiskey. We're going in. For 2 days, Maybelle did not sleep. Silas was the surgeon. She was the nurse. The old trapper was a man of rough, profound skill. He laid Eli on his stomach, and while Maybelle held a lantern and poured whiskey onto the wound, Silas sterilized his own skinning knife in the fire. Hold him, Silas said. Maybelle put her hands on Eli's shoulders. Silas cut into him. Eli screamed, a high, strangled sound, even in his delirium. Maybelle sobbed, but she held him, her knuckles white. Got it, Silas grunted, his hand emerging, bloody. He held up a flattened piece of lead. He tossed it into the fire. Now the real work starts. He packed the wound with a poultice of herbs she didn't recognize and stitched it shut with a crude needle and sinew. Now, he said, his face grim. We wait. The fever will decide. The fever raged. Eli was lost. He was in Texas, in the canyons, in the barn with her. He called her name. He called for Clara. He called for his mother. Maybelle sat by the cot, wiping his face with a cool, damp cloth, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She would not let him go. She held his hand, his large, calloused hand that had been so strong, now limp in her own. You can't, she whispered to him, her voice raw. You can't leave me. Eli, I'm not done running, but I can't run alone anymore. You promised. You swore he would never touch me again. You have to keep your promise. On the third night, his breathing changed. It deepened. The shaking stopped. She touched his forehead. It was cool, damp. The fever had broken. She sagged, the relief so profound it was like a physical pain. She laid her head on the cot, beside his hand, and wept from sheer exhaustion. He was sleeping, truly, peacefully sleeping. She watched him. The hard lines of his face were softened. He looked like the man she'd seen in the barn, before the world came crashing back in. Silas was snoring in his chair by the fire. The cabin was quiet, safe. Maybelle leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. If you live, she whispered, her voice barely a breath, I will be your wife. We don't need a church. We don't need a ring. I'm yours. You just have to live. She sat back. He didn't stir. She watched him. Her heart, which had been a cold knot of fear for days, slowly, painfully, beginning to beat again. Eli woke 2 days later. His eyes were clear. He looked around the unfamiliar cabin, his gaze sharp, assessing. He saw the stone hearth, the drying pelts. He saw Silas, asleep in his chair, and then he saw her. Maybelle was slumped on the floor, her head resting on the edge of his cot. Asleep. She was a ruin. Her face was gaunt, streaked with dirt and tears. Her hair was a matted tangle. She was wearing his flannel shirt, now stained with his blood. "Maybelle," he whispered. His voice was a dry croak. Her head snapped up, her eyes, wide and bloodshot, focused on him. "Eli? Where, Silas?" "He saved you," she said, her voice breaking. "He cut the bullet out. We're in his cabin. We're safe." He tried to sit up. A sharp pain in his back made him grunt and fall back. "The men. They're gone. Silas tracked them. They went back to Laramie. They think you're dead. They think we're both dead. Frozen in the storm." He lay back, absorbing it. He looked at her, at the state of her. He looked at his own hand, which she was clutching as if it were a lifeline. "You look tired," he said. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "So do you." They were quiet. He was alive. He was here. The reality of it was too big. "We can't go to Montana," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "Not yet." He looked at his hand, the one she was holding. "I've been running for 10 years. Maybelle, from Finney's ghost, from a corrupt judge. I ran, and I kept running. It's all I know, but it's not a life. It's just waiting. Waiting for the next man on a horse. Waiting for the next reward poster." He met her eyes. His were clear and harder than she had ever seen them. "He shot me in the back. He put his hands on you. He tried to have us both murdered. We can't run from that. If we run, he wins. He'll just do it to the next girl, to the next homesteader who can't pay his debts." "What are you saying?" she whispered, though she already knew. A cold dread filled her. "I'm saying we go back," Eli said, his voice flat. "We're done running. We've finished this." They rode back to Laramie Fork on a Sunday. Silas had given them fresh clothes, food, and his 2 best horses. "You're a bigger fool than I thought, boy," the old trapper had said, clapping Eli on his good shoulder. "But you're the right kind of fool." He had pressed a small, heavy bag of coins into Eli's hand. "Go clear your name." The church bells were ringing, not for Sunday service, for a wedding. Burns, furious at being cheated, had not waited. He had posted a notice that his bride, Maybelle Sims, having run off in a fit of girlish panic and been safely recovered, was to be married 1 week hence. He had sent men to her mother's house, virtual prisoners, to ensure her compliance. The church was full. The entire town was there to see the scandal, to watch the powerful Hezekiah Burns finally claim his prize. Maybelle's mother was in the front pew, her face veiled, weeping. Hezekiah Burns stood at the altar, his broad chest puffed out in a new suit. He looked triumphant, a man who always got what he wanted. The music swelled. The pastor began to speak. The church doors slammed open. Every head turned. The music stopped. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Eli stood in the doorway. He was pale, his left arm in a sling made from a strip of white chemise. But he was alive. His pistol was in his right hand, held loosely at his side. Beside him, no longer in his flannel shirt, but in a simple, clean wool dress Silas had given her, stood Maybelle. "What is the meaning of this?" Burns roared, his face turning a deep, apoplectic purple. "Sheriff, arrest this man! He's a wanted murderer! He's an escaped fugitive!" Eli ignored him. He and Maybelle walked, side by side, down the center aisle. The crowd parted for them like water for a stone. Eli stopped in front of the altar. He looked at Burns. "You tried to kill me," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the silent church. "You sent 3 men to ambush me at Rock Creek. You sent them to hunt this woman down and kill us both." "Lies," Burns sputtered. "He's a criminal. Sheriff, do your duty." The sheriff, a portly man with a nervous twitch, started to move. He offered $500 for my capture. Eli continued, his voice calm. Dead or alive? Because I fired a warning shot at his man, Jeb, who was trespassing on my property. He's a squatter, Burns yelled. And he's a predator, Eli said, his voice dropping, lethal. He turned his gaze from Burns. He looked into the pews. His eyes found the seamstress, a small woman named Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable. Eli said, "You were at the dress fitting. Tell this town what you saw. Tell them where Mr. Burns put his hands." The woman went white. She looked at Burns, who was staring at her with murderous intent. She looked at Maybelle, who was watching her, not with pleading, but with a cold, quiet strength. "Mrs." Gable stood up, her hands twisting. He, she stammered. "He touched her. Improper. He said he was inspecting his property. He put his hands all over her." A low murmur went through the crowd. "And her mother, Mrs." Gable was crying now, the fear broken by a sudden, sharp anger. "Her mother, Martha Sims, stood in the doorway. She watched him do it, and she closed the door. She locked her in with him." All eyes turned to Martha, who let out a thin wail and fainted in the pew. "He did the same to me." A voice called out from the back. It was Sarah, a serving girl from the saloon. "When my PA couldn't pay his bill, he said I could work it off. He did the same to me, and he did it to Sadie Peters, just before she walked into the river last spring." The church erupted. The murmurs became a roar of outrage. This was not a debt. This was a sickness. "Sheriff!" Burns bellowed, his face a mask of sweat and panic. "Arrest him. He is wanted for murder in Texas." "That's true," the pastor said, his voice booming over the crowd. He stepped down from the altar, a piece of yellow paper in his hand. "He was wanted. I took the liberty of sending a telegraph, at Mr. Silas's expense, to the sheriff in Sweetwater, Texas." He held up the paper. "I received this reply an hour ago. The warrant for Eli's arrest was dismissed 7 years ago. Following the death of the corrupt Judge Finney, the Sweetwater sheriff confirms the killing was a clear act of self-defense. This man," he pointed to Eli, "is a free man." The sheriff, seeing the entire town turn on Burns, seeing the proof in the pastor's hand, made his choice. He walked past Eli and put his hand on Hezekiah Burns's arm. "Mr. Burns, I think you'd best come with me." Burns stared, his empire crumbling in a single, terrible moment. Eli did not watch him being led away. He turned to Maybelle. The church was in chaos, but they were in the eye of the storm. He held out his good hand. Maybelle ignored the sobs of her mother, the stares of the townsfolk. She walked to him and took his hand. She turned, with him, to face the crowd. "I ran from this wedding," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent church. "I was lost, and I was found by a man who had nothing, no name, no money, and no home. I chose the man with nothing, and he is everything I need." She squeezed Eli's hand. He did not smile, but his eyes were on her, and they were full of a light she had never seen. Together, they turned their backs on the town of Laramie Fork. They walked down the aisle, past the shocked faces, past her mother, and out the open church doors, into the cold, bright, and unforgiving sunlight. They were, for the first time, free. They did not look back. They rode out of Laramie Fork with the town still reeling in the church, a chorus of hushed accusations and the sound of Martha Sims's weeping fading behind them. They did not look back at the small, mortgaged house, nor at the bank, nor at the face of the broken man who had tried to own them. They were two riders, heading north with 2 horses, a mule, and a bag of coins that felt heavier than gold. They rode past the abandoned ranch. The storm had left it looking battered, the barn door hanging on one hinge. It was a skeleton, a memory of a life that was not theirs. Eli did not even turn his head as they passed it. They rode for 3 days. Into the high country, the air grew thinner, cleaner. The wound in Eli's back was a dull, hot ache, but it was healing. The gash on his arm was already a scar. They were hard, scarred people, but they were whole. They crossed the pass just as the snows were beginning to melt, leaving Wyoming behind them. Before them lay Montana. It was a valley wider than anything Maybelle had ever seen, a great green bowl carved by a river that ran the color of jade. "This is it," Eli said. He stopped his horse on the ridge. It was not his father's old claim. That was too far, too buried in the past. This was just land, a high meadow that overlooked the river, sheltered from the north wind by a thick stand of ancient pines. There was no cabin. There was no barn. There was only the land and the sky and the clean, sharp smell of pine. "It will be hard," Eli said, his voice quiet. Maybelle looked at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. "We know hard," she said. They used the money from Silas to file a claim at the nearest land office. A 2-day ride downriver. They bought an axe, a crosscut saw, nails, a sack of flour, a sack of seed potatoes, and 2 heavy wool blankets. They began with nothing but their own 4 hands. The work was the hardest thing Maybelle had ever known. Her life in Laramie Fork had been one of soft, useless poverty. This was a different poverty. This was the poverty of creation. Eli, his arm still healing, began to fell the trees. The sound of his axe was the first and last sound of the day, a steady, rhythmic thunk that was the heartbeat of their new life. Maybelle worked beside him. Her hands, which had only ever known a needle, were raw and bleeding by the end of the first week. She hauled the smaller logs. She helped him peel the bark. She mixed the mud and moss to chink the walls. They built their home. It was 1 room. The floor was packed earth. The fireplace was river stone that Eli had hauled, 1 by 1, on his back. It was small, and it was rough, and it was the most beautiful place on earth. Life settled into a rhythm. It was a simple, brutal, and honest life. Every morning, Eli rose in the dark, his axe his constant companion. He was clearing the land, building fences, and cutting a mountain of firewood for the winter he knew was coming. The haunted, hunted look of the man in the abandoned barn faded. His shoulders, broadened by the work, were straight. The lines around his eyes were from squinting into the sun, not from fear. Maybelle's world was the garden. She fought the rocky, stubborn soil, digging with her bare hands when the tools were not enough. She planted the potatoes, the beans, the corn. She learned to use her father's knife, her knife, now, to skin the rabbits Eli trapped and clean the fish he caught in the river. Her hands became as hard and calloused as his. Word spread, as it does in empty places. A few homesteaders, families scattered 10, 20 miles apart, learned of the quiet couple on the hill. One day, a man on a mule rode up. He was a homesteader named Miller, with a wife and 6 children. "Ma'am," he said, holding his hat, "we heard you know your letters." "I do," Maybelle said. "Our children," he said, gesturing vaguely south. "They're growing up wild. We ain't got a school. We ain't got a teacher. We could pay, not in coin, but in flour, a side of bacon come winter." So Maybelle became a teacher. 3 days a week, a small group of children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, would ride to the cabin. She taught them on the porch, showing them how to form their letters, how to do their sums. She would read to them, her voice clear and patient. Eli would often sit on a nearby stump, mending tack or sharpening his tools, just to listen to the sound of her. It was a sound of civilization, of peace. It was the sound of a home. The first winter was the test. It came early, and it came with a fury, as if the land itself was trying to break them. The snow piled in drifts that buried their small cabin, covering the windows, leaving only the chimney and a small tunnel to the woodpile. The wind howled for weeks on end, a high, lonely sound that promised death. The world shrank to the four walls of their cabin, but it was not the prison of the storm. It was a refuge. The fireplace Eli had built drew perfectly. The cabin was always warm. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine smoke, coffee, and the savory smell of rabbit stew. In the long, dark, snow-blind days, they worked. Eli carved new handles for his tools, his hands sure and steady. Maybelle learned to spin the wool she had traded for, her hands finding a new, ancient rhythm. And they talked. They filled the silence that had once defined them. They filled it with small observations, with plans for the spring planting, with stories of Silas, with dreams of a child. They were not two broken people, hiding. They were two whole people, building. The brutal world could howl, but it could not get in. It was on one of those nights, deep in the heart of that first hard winter, that it happened. A blizzard had been raging for 2 days, a solid, screaming wall of white. Eli was sitting at their small, rough-hewn table, cleaning his rifle by the light of the lantern. The fire crackled, a bright, warm heart in the dark room. Maybelle had been quiet, working on something by the hearth, her back to him. "Eli," she said. Her voice was soft, almost shy. He looked up, his hand stilled on the rifle. She was standing in the center of the room. She had changed her clothes. She was wearing a dress he had never seen. It was not satin, it was not lace. It was made from old, scrubbed flour sacks, sewn together with careful, even stitches. It was the color of wheat. It was plain, with long sleeves and a high neck. It was the simplest dress in the world, and in the warm glow of the firelight, it made her look like a queen. I've been saving it," she whispered, her hands smoothing the rough fabric. "I made it from the sacks. I wanted one of my own." He said nothing. He just watched her. He had never seen anything so beautiful. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She was not the desperate girl in the barn. She was not the angry, defiant woman in the church. She was a woman. She was his wife. She stopped in front of him. "We never had a pastor, Eli," she said, her voice quiet. "And we don't have a ring." She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "We just have this room, this fire, this life we built." She leaned closer, her warm breath brushing his ear. "Tonight, Eli," she whispered, "I am a bride again, but I am not scared anymore." His breath caught. He put the rifle down. His hands, calloused and hard from the axe, rose and cupped her face. He was shaking. He looked into her eyes and saw no fear, no ghosts. He saw only himself, reflected. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the storm. It was not the raw, claiming kiss of the hayloft. It was a long, slow, deep kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee, and forever. It was a vow. He did not lift her. He did not rush. He led her to the thick bearskin rug Silas had given them, the one in front of the hearth. He laid her down gently, the firelight dancing on her skin. They made love. There was no pain. There was no shame. There were no ghosts. There was no Hezekiah Burns, no weeping mother, no past at all. There was only the warmth of the fire, the sound of the wind screaming harmlessly outside their walls, and the slow, deep, perfect peace of two people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. It was not a taking or a hiding. It was a homecoming. After, they lay tangled in the wool blankets, the fire burning down to a soft, red glow. Outside, the wind had finally died. The snow had begun to fall again. Not a blizzard, but a soft, quiet, steady fall. It covered the tracks. It covered the raw, cleared land. It covered their cabin, burying them deep in a world of white. Eli was asleep. his breath even, his strong arm draped over her, his hand holding hers. Maybelle lay awake, watching the snowflakes drift past the small, frosted window. She was warm. She was safe. She was home. She squeezed his hand and whispered to the quiet dark, "I'm never running again." Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below and let's get to know each other. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on Eli and Maybelle's journey.